Well, firstly, one of the things that has always appealed to me in the 35 years I've spent in the oil and gas industry has been that diversity of culture. One might argue that the oil and gas industry doesn't have the level of gender diversity you would wish, but in terms of every other dimension of diversity, is extraordinarily diverse. And I have always led teams, led organizations that bring considerable diversity to the table, and that is enriching. I think one of the things you have to be very sensitive to, however, is understanding how decisions are made, how people operate in those different cultures. And in my prepared remarks, which I'll cover later on today, I'll talk about an experience in Norway where at one stage in my career I was asked to lead Europe-Africa for a company called Halliburton. And Norway rolled up into that jurisdiction. And I brought a very American directive leadership style to that business and managed to frustrate and lose the engagement of several thousand employees in the process very, very quickly. And I think what it taught me, it was a hell of a lesson. And what it taught me was that you really do have to be quite sensitive to how decisions are made, how people operate, particularly in cultures where consensual decision making is perhaps more strongly developed than it might be in Anglo-Saxon cultures, and that's certainly the case in places like the Netherlands. It's certainly the case in places like Norway. I think other things you need to be sensitive to are, in some Asian countries, people can be very respectful of leadership to a point where they might not always share what's on their mind, what's really going on in a business, what the real opportunity might be. And you have to approach the engagement of people who might come from that environment with different techniques, different mechanisms. No, I don't mean Machiavellian. You engage with them. When you win their trust, you win an ability for them to share what they're really thinking in different ways than you might do in Texas, for example, or the UK. I think, so I can give a very specific example. When I ran a global organization in one role in Houston when I was at Halliburton, where we had a leadership team that was distributed across the planet. We had people in Asia Pacific, we had people in Europe, we had people in Latin America, North America, and in Africa. And we had a policy of, wherever possible, putting local talent into leadership roles. So an incredibly diverse leadership team. So I think one of the first things you have to do is define the norms by which that team should operate. And initially, it's very important, I think, that team comes together physically in a single location, and you work together as a team in a single location to define the principles by which you're going to operate. But I think as that trust then builds, there's much more you can do by video conferencing, there's much more you can do through teleconferencing and so forth. But I think fundamentally, you have to agree what the team is about. What are you trying to achieve? What is your objective? What is the common goal? What aligns you? What's your North Star? So that everyone is aligned on what it is you're trying to do. And I think irrespective of culture, if there's alignment on what it is you're trying to do, then I think diversity of culture, diversity of experience only benefits the execution of that objective, because people will bring many different ideas and many different thoughts on perhaps how that's been successfully achieved in other places around the world. Well, one of the things I noticed coming back to the UK 3 years ago was the lack of trust on the part of society in big business. If you look at things like the Edelman Trust Barometer, 47% of the people in this country don't trust big business. We seem to have lost the connection between successful commerce, a tax base, and the funding of all of the things we hold near and dear in this country. So as a backdrop to some of the decisions we made around responsible business, employee directors and so forth, I had a deep sense that we needed to mend the relationship between big business and society. And Capita was one vehicle by which we could do that. We're also going through a very large transformation. 75,000 people around the world who wanted to be part of the planning of that transformation. What better way to give colleagues, and I refer to them as colleagues, not employees, an opportunity to influence in that process is to give the two of them a position on the board. We're in fact the first FTSE company to ever do that. I think it's good practice. They've been on the board for 6 months and have made a very material contribution to the thinking of the board. In fact, we have a 34-year-old millennial who has single-handedly reduced the average age of the board by 4 years. He is regularly asked how his generation, his cohort of people across the company would feel about a particular topic, and is providing insight that I guarantee you we would not be gaining had we not put that individual on the board. So I'm a big advocate. I'm not suggesting it's right for every company, but for Capita, in the middle of a multi-year transformation, I think to give our colleagues an opportunity to influence that process has been hugely powerful. In fact, I'm on the record as saying that I wish I'd been smart enough to think of that earlier on in my career. I'm not sure there's anything I have done in terms of employee engagement that has had as material an impact as a decision to have employee directors. Well, I mean, it comes back to some of the comments I was making earlier on about responsible business, and I'd like to think we are, I describe Capita as a progressive, purpose-led, responsible business. We're progressive because of some of the deeds we've undertaken to demonstrate that we are purpose-led and that we are responsible. Purpose-led, we're about creating better outcomes. That's about creating better outcomes for all of our stakeholders, and our colleagues are a significant stakeholder group. We have too great a divide between the lowest paid people in this country and the highest paid people in this country. The minimum wage is £7.70. The real living wage is £10.30. That's a big delta in terms of the quality of life our employers can have by moving onto that salary base. And again, not just very positively received by the employees concerned, in total about 15,000 of them, but I think sends a very strong message to other companies as well, particularly in our sector, who currently might not be paying the real living wage. Well, until businesses are completely run by bots, it will always be about people. I mean, ultimately, any business is a cohort of people that you organize in the form of an operating model to achieve a set of outcomes. And I have had a deeply held belief for many years that if you have a highly motivated, proud colleague base who are proud to work for the company they work for, they feel well compensated and rewarded for what they do, they believe in the purpose of the company, they believe in your values and your behaviors, they believe in where leadership is taking the company, then you will get better outcomes for the customers and clients that those same colleagues serve. And that's really what we're trying to achieve. There is an ethical and moral aspect to being a progressive, purpose-led, responsible business. And what we've done around our pension, paying down the deficit, what we've done to ensure that everyone is on the same percentage of salary as a pension contribution, which is not the norm within FTSE companies, of course, that all speaks to being a responsible business. But ultimately, it manifests itself in an ability to attract talent that we might not otherwise be able to attract. We've hired a number of people out of some very large American tech companies that should remain nameless in the last 6 months who have joined us for less compensation, but done so because they recognize we're taking a different path with regard to responsible business and being purpose-led. And that's particularly true amongst the younger generations who I think rightly and appropriately think more holistically about the factors that determine whether company X or company Y is an enterprise they wish to work for. And I think the more attractive we make ourselves with regard to our responsible business criteria and credentials, I think the easier it's going to be to attract the kind of talent we want. Well, it's both. Again, we're on the record as saying that between 3 and 6% of our employee base, the roles within our organisation will disappear over the course of the next 18 months through the embrace of robotic process automation in particular. Now, thankfully, That's through voluntary attrition. We're not going to be letting people go. But if you extend that scale of adoption across commerce in general in the UK, then you quickly get a sense that unless there are plans for how we would reskill and retrain these people, that we will have a significant unemployment challenge going forward. And I think one of the things I worry about is that the future of work, as it is referred to, is not on the political agenda today. I mean, we've had, obviously, the last 3 years a major distraction in this country that Germany and Singapore, for example, haven't. And both of those countries have thought quite diligently about what automation means, particularly in the context of what it means with regard to the essential skills in particular, and vocational skills, that people are going to have to acquire if they're going to be able to contribute to society. I think the other challenge potentially it faces is that many of the companies whose employees will be replaced by robotics are low margin businesses that frankly are not going to be in a position to fund the retraining and the reskilling of these employees themselves. So there's going to have to be a role for government, as in fact we see in these other countries, in terms of ensuring that that reskilling, that retraining is economically viable. Now, on the upside, on a more positive note, I think it's going to remove a lot of the very boring, repetitive tasks that many people in many roles perform. People are going to be able to do more creative things, which I think ultimately most people find more satisfying. But I think also it's going to lead to improvements in customer service and customer experience. I mean, if you train a bot correctly, it is 100% reliable. Unless there's a power cut, it's going to continue to do what it does, and that means more consistent service, more reliable service to clients and to customers who are the recipients of that. So I think a lot of opportunity, a lot of improvement in productivity. Ultimately, that's going to create economic benefit in the form of investment that we're going to be able to make back at the company level and at the national level as well, in terms of how we compete on a global stage. I think it's one of them. I think Brexit will raise obviously a number of trade challenges unless we're able to very quickly negotiate the trade deals that we're all hoping we will. Is it potentially the most disruptive factor in employment patterns over the next decade? Yes, I think it could be. I mean, people make comparison with the Industrial Revolution, people coming out of agriculture and into cities. People talk about the transition from a manufacturing industry to a services economy here in the UK, but those occurred over decades. This could occur over a decade. So the sheer velocity at which this is going to happen is potentially challenging, particularly whilst we have had the distractions we have had. And perhaps I'm not taking both the opportunity and the challenge of automation perhaps as seriously politically at this point in time as we should be. It may be my positive disposition, but I don't think of challenges. I mean, I 35 years, I spent 10 years as a so-called academic, a research fellow and a lecturer in the academic system in this country, 10 years in software, 10 years in oilfield services, 2 years in engineering and construction, and now I'm 2 years into the outsourcing space. And I think what has always motivated me, what has always sort of got me out of bed in the morning, is the opportunity to in some small way make a difference. And in my prepared remarks, in my talk later on today, I'll talk about the challenges of turnarounds. I mean, they're not for the faint of heart, but one of the beauties of turnarounds is that they are extraordinarily satisfying, intellectually satisfying when you pull them off successfully. And also, you create, back to our purpose statement, a much better outcome for a very large cohort of people. I mean, we still have 65,000 employees in this company who are dependent upon the successful execution of their strategy to ensure they have a salary. And waking up to that challenge every morning is deeply, it's a huge responsibility, but it's also deeply satisfying to know that, in the case of our journey the last 2 years, we dodged an existential bullet and we have a company now that has a future and is transforming and will over time get back onto a growth trajectory. So there are times, I remember in my oil and gas days, my last job at Halliburton, sort of October 2014, I was running 20 billion, 44,000 person organization, and 12 months later, the revenue had halved and the employee base had halved. That's challenging. That's to downscale, to resize a business to that magnitude is very, very challenging. But I think you have to focus on, it drives decisions. It focuses you to think about things, efficiency, productivity, long-term competitive differentiation, ensuring you retain and invest in the right talent. Ultimately it makes you more efficient, it makes you lean. There are Darwinian aspects of it which are less palatable, obviously, but ultimately you're creating a more sustainable business at the end of the day. And when the business cycle comes back, you're in a better position to take advantage of that and to benefit from that, again, for all stakeholders. I don't think there's one. There are a couple of things I would cite. Firstly, I think passion in business is hugely important. I think if you bring authentic passion to leadership roles, it's quite amazing what you can get leadership teams and organizations to achieve. So that would be number one. Number two, as you get more senior in organizations, you have to spend an extraordinary amount of time on talent, the selection of talent and the development of talent. As a CEO, you're only ever as good as the people you surround yourself with, not just directly, but at various levels in the hierarchy. And I think investment in talent, attracting it, developing it, motivating it, is probably the most effective way of driving a successful business. I think the third thing I would say is constantly be curious. Curious about what's going on in the world around you. Curious about how a particular contract or a particular client opportunity is progressing. You almost develop curiosity as a sixth sense. And where is technology going? What does automation mean, as we discussed earlier on? But then also applying it internally to how effective your business is at prosecuting your strategy, prosecuting your business model. And at times, doing a deep dive, rolling your sleeves up and really getting to understand how well we are or are not executing on a particular opportunity for a client. You learn a huge amount by bringing that level of curiosity to the broader landscape in which you operate, but also the business you might be running.